A few years ago, when the congregation decided to enter into a period of developmental ministry, we went through a process of identifying a number of questions that we wanted to answer. First Unitarian Universalist had just been through a rough patch and had seen the negotiated resignations of 3 senior ministers or co-senior ministers within the span of a decade. Members of the congregation wanted to know, as you put it at the time, how can we have a healthy relationship with our senior minister? As you collectively thought about the question, you came to the conclusion that in order to answer it, you also had to explore another question. What kind of church do we want to become? What kind of church do we want to become? You might all recall that your efforts to answer this query resulted in the new mission, vision, and covenant statements. And you'll likely have observed that over the last months, we've tried to incorporate these into the life of our community. The phrase widening love's circle appears on most of our literature. We recite our new covenant each time we gather for worship. And I sincerely hope that the commitment to be a growing, multicultural, multi-generational, and multiracial congregation in the city's diverse urban center will guide you in your deliberations in the coming weeks over what to do about the lot that is for sale across Fannin St. This morning, we celebrate the 110th anniversary of the founding of our beloved congregation. So I want to direct our attention back to that question that led to the creation of our vision, mission, and covenant. What kind of church do we want to become? Let me suggest that throughout our congregation's history, we have struggled to answer this question. Now, this is not something particularly to be ashamed of. Understanding and defining our individual and collective identities is one of the great tasks of our lives. Consider how each in our own way, we all struggle with the question, who am I? In truth, as the seasons change, we answer it differently. As a child, a teenager, a young adult, my answer to it would have included words like son, brother, grandson, or nephew. Midlife, my answer necessitates inclusion of the word parent on that list. What is more, the emphasis I place on the different parts of my identity change depending on time and location. Now, standing before you on a Sunday morning, I'm principally a preacher. Tonight, at home, I'll be primarily a family man. I anticipate that your experience is similar, that the predominant understanding we have of who we are is one thing at work, another at home, and something else when we're at First Unitarian Universalist. Over the years, I've heard members of the congregation say that the only place they feel comfortable fully being themselves is amidst our religious community. Who am I? It is a profoundly religious question. It implies that there's some sort of unifying thread that unites the Colin who cooks up the sermon for Sunday morning with the Colin who cooks up Sunday dinner. In our answers, we often seek to disrupt the famous monologue from William Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, and the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. Questing after an answer questing after a unifying answer is what prompts a lot of people to come to a religious community like ours. While some of you were raised within the Unitarian Universalist tradition, most of you came to it as adults, either as nuns or duns. The first group, the nuns, are those of you who have a spiritual orientation but grew up unconnected to traditional religious institutions. The second group includes those of you who were raised within a religious tradition but later decided you were done with it. Done with Catholicism, done with a rigid form of Islam, done with Pentecostal Christianity, done with Mormonism, done with a strict type of Judaism, done with Lutheranism, just done. You asked the question, who am I? And answered, not that. Who am I? Whether you are a nun or a dun, if your background prior to joining our congregation was other than Unitarian Universalist, it's likely that some sort of question or crisis of identity brought you through our doors. When you connected with us for the first time, so many of my new member congregation conversations have a similar structure. We are newly married. We come from different religious backgrounds. We want a community in which to raise our children, you will tell me. My spouse has died. We were together for 40 years, and I'm trying to figure out who I am without her. You might let me know. The church I grew up in rejected me. I'm trans or gay or queer, you remark. I need a religious community who loves me for who I am, you continue. Whatever the case, none or done, it is usually the situation that you became part of a Unitarian Universalist community because you're seeking to answer some variation of the question, who am I? Religion has been trying to provide a collective answer to that question ever since there's been such a thing as religion, which is to say, as long as humanity has existed. We hear attempts to answer this question in so many of the world's great scriptures. They're there in the Bhagavad Gita when Arjuna, the text protagonist, tells Krishna, "My will is paralyzed and I am utterly confused. Tell me which is the better path for me." And Krishna responds by informing him, the impermanent has no reality. Reality lies in the eternal. They're present in the query directed to the Buddha, "Are you a god?" And his response, "I am awake." They're found in Christian and Jewish works, and in the words of the great humanists and passages from the poets. Dofu. After the laws of their being, all creatures pursue happiness. Why have I let an official career swerve me from my goal? Ada Limon. I have before been tricked into believing I could both be an I and the world. Who am I? Our congregation provides each of us the space to explore the most essential of questions without the limitations of doctrine or the confines of creed. We gather to seek the truths of our questing souls have sought, as our own lyricist Emily Ladner wrote. And as we gather to answer that question as individuals, we have been challenged again and again to answer it as a community. What type of church do we want to become? How we have responded to that question collectively greatly shapes our answers to our own individual questions. One collective answer invites people in. Another leaves some people out, suggests to them that who am I might be better pursued elsewhere. The earliest evidence that some people in Houston needed to answer the question, who am I, within a Unitarian Universalist community dates to the 1880s. At some point in that decade, the Universalist minister, Erasmus Manford, visited the city during his missionary efforts throughout the West. He quickly left, reporting to his co-religionists back east, "The town of Houston, when I was there, was a moral desert. A hell on earth." A hell on earth. This is perhaps why, on April 30th, 1899, the Universalist minister Quillian Shin preached a sermon in Houston in which he put forth the first attempt to answer the question, what type of church do we want to become? He told the gathered community then that our purpose was to make this world a paradise, a pleasant, happy place for all to live in. something other than a hell on earth. When he made the statement under the encouragement of his distant cousins John Carvel Hooper and Asa Shin, he had been visiting Houston on and off for about 5 years and preaching the occasional sermon here. But it was not till that year, 1899, that he felt that the ground was fertile enough for the planting of a Universalist congregation. He managed to pull together 7 members to start a religious community. Their answer to the question, what type of church do we want to become, was rather clear to them, a Universalist one. Unfortunately, Houstonians did not find it to be a very compelling answer. A pattern emerged. Quillen Shin would come, offer an engaging sermon with a title like, "Where Will You Spend Eternity?" energize the city's little band of Universalists, and then depart. Soon after he left, their efforts to establish an institution would grow dormant. No congregation grew. It was not until 1908 that efforts to establish a Universalist church gained traction. John Carvel Hooper managed to gather together some 40 people with the intention of forming a religious community. They elected him as president, and within a year they'd raised enough money to hire their first minister, Charles Rogers. With him in the pulpit, the congregation began to hold regular services on October 3rd, 1909. At the time, our religious forebears had not done a very good job of answering the question, what type of church do we want to become? The congregation was even confused in its name. It was called Unity Church Universalist. Its membership contained Unitarians, Universalists, as well as folks affiliated with the New Thought movement. A few of these were adherents of what later became the Unity Church. A larger number were affiliated with the Theosophical tradition. So here at the very start, we do find one answer to the question, what type of church do we want to become? It's often been one that is comfortable with religious pluralism. Unfortunately, in early 20th century Houston, this response was untenable. The New Thought folks split off to form their own congregations, the Unity people leaving in 1911 and the city's Theosophical Lodge forming in 1912. The same year, Charles Rogers left Houston and the Universalist Church stopped meeting. The Ladies' Aid Group, however, continued to meet and hold teas in their members' homes. And it was one of their members, the Dr. Frances Brandt, who challenged the community to have a more coherent understanding of its identity. Under her leadership, it is reported in the Universalist record book that in 1912, the women in the religious community had gone over to the Unitarians. It was a wise move. The American Unitarian Association sent its field secretary, William Channing Brown, to Houston for a month to organize a Unitarian church. And so on Sunday, February 15th, 1914, he held the founding service of the First Unitarian Church of Houston. There were 21 people present. They elected a board of trustees whose number included our old, persistent friend, John Carvel Hooper. They also adopted a covenant or bond of union that sought to provide an identity for the congregation by stating why its members came together. It read, "In the love of truth and the Spirit of Jesus, we unite for worship of God and service of man." They also called a minister, Thomas Clayton. He stayed until the spring of 1918. Under his leadership, the congregation more than doubled, reaching something like 60 people, and purchased its first building, a cottage in Montrose near what until very recently was the Whole Foods on Elgin. During his ministry, the First Unitarian Church of Houston also committed to several aspects of its identity that have provided consistent answers to the question, what type of church do we want to become? Religious education and music programs were established. A commitment was made to be a center city congregation. In those years, it must be noted, the church held to Houston's Jim Crow practices. While the archives include no record of a conscious decision to do so, in its early decades, the First Unitarian Church of Houston was an exclusively white institution. This, of course, put it in the same company of every other historically white denomination in the city. Texas in those years was rigorously segregated and was then, as it is now, one of the nation's leaders in hate crimes and violence against black people. During Reverend Clayton's tenure, Houston was the site of one of the most notorious riots in U.S. history, the 1917 Camp Logan Mutiny, which claimed 21 lives. It also resulted in a show trial, after which 13 African American soldiers were executed. All of them have been subsequently exonerated. There's no record of whether or not Reverend Clayton spoke out against this gross act of white supremacy and injustice. Indeed, there's not much of a record of anything he did. We don't have any of his sermons in our archives. None of them appear to be preserved in universities that collect Unitarian Universalist material. Following his departure in 1918, the congregation entered into a period of disorganization. There was no regular minister for 5 years. James Pearden came and went. The Ladies' Aid Group, long since named the Women's Alliance, paid most of the bills. Then in 1929, Thomas Henry Saunders arrived. He was here till 1935. Saunders proclaimed that the purpose of the congregation was the emancipation of humanity from superstition and credulity. And his answer to what type of church do we want to become helped solidify our movement in Houston. While he was here, board chair Walter Cronkite, father of the famous journalist of the same name, oversaw the purchase of our current property and the construction of our first building on it. Unfortunately, his tenure also saw the establishment of an unhealthy pattern in congregational life, one that has since haunted the community. Sanders' time in the pulpit ended in the spring of 1935 when he was pushed to resign after having a conflict with the church's board. He was soon followed by Arthur Wynne. Like his predecessors, his energies seem to have been largely directed towards solidifying a Unitarian congregation rather than looking outwards towards serving the larger community. These efforts, though, paid off, and by the time he left, 3 years later, First Unitarian had expanded its religious education program, established a committee structure, and installed its first organ. What type of church do we want to become? Arthur Wynne was followed by John Clarence Petrie. He was something of a dun and had first left Catholicism and then Episcopalianism for Unitarianism. And his ministry included one of the greatest struggles over how the congregation would define itself we have faced. First Unitarian thrived. A professional organist, whose name is recorded as Mrs. Ray Lasley, was hired. So were professional singers. The building was expanded. Membership grew past 100 for the first time. The growth of the congregation was matched by the growth of Reverend Petrie's dissatisfaction with Unitarianism. The congregation changed its name to the Unitarian Congregational Church, dropped its affiliation with the Regional Conference of the American Unitarian Association, and associated with the Texas Conference of Congregational Churches. His answer to what type of church do we want to become was that our congregation was to be theologically Christian and politically reactionary. He attacked humanism as the worst enemy of humanity. He quoted far-right philosophers like the economist Friedrich Hayek from the pulpit and attacked some of our movement's great civil rights leaders in his sermons. He proclaimed that he was devoted to driving out every form of subversive Americanism from Unitarianism and combating its anti-Christian trend. In spite of this, he inspired the congregation to build our present sanctuary. Because of this, by 1949, the congregation had had enough of him. Petrie was pushed to resign. He returned to the Episcopalian fold and finished life as the sort of anti-communist preacher who published essays in magazines preferred by members of the John Birch Society. What kind of church do we want to become? Well, one of the answers was not that kind. And Petrie's and the end to Petrie's ministry really clarified the question. The congregation made room for humanists within its ranks. It reestablished relations with the regional Unitarian conference. The members who were loyal to Petrie left to form the First Congregational Church of Houston, and the congregation called Horace Westwood. His ministry was marked by new answers to the question, what type of church do we want to become? In early 1954, the family of the now famous actresses Debbie Allen and Felicia Rashad began to attend services. And in 1954, almost immediately following the Brown versus Board of Education decision, the congregation committed to no longer being the first exclusively white, or to being an exclusively white community, making it one of the first, if not the first, historically white church in the city to desegregate. First Unitarian Universalist, sadly, still has a long way to go into becoming a truly multi-racial religious community. But the vote back in 1954 to desegregate was nonetheless a historic one. It was accompanied by a commitment for the first time in the congregation's history to collective social justice work. And it brought the congregation's first African-American members, Debbie and Felicia's mother, the playwright Vivian Allen, into membership. Reverend Westwood was active in the civil rights movement. He marched in Selma. He preached against the old Southern white supremacist order in his sermons. For the first time, the congregation welcomed black preachers into its pulpit. During this time, the sanctuary also caught fire. How exactly has never been determined, and the whole church came close to burning down. Nonetheless, First Unitarian grew like it never had been before. Membership reached over 800. Half the church left to establish what's now Emerson Unitarian Church over by Galleria. The congregation removed the word Jesus from its covenant and collaborated with the local Jewish Reform movement. The building was expanded again. Westwood's 22-year ministry was the longest in the congregation's history. It was followed by Webster Kitchell's 9-year tenure, during which the congregation did not substantively change its answer to what kind of church do we want to become. Kitchell moved to New Mexico in 1981. The Reverend Bob Shibley arrived in 1982. He challenged the congregation to respond to what type of church do we want to become in substantively new ways. He came out of the closet shortly after arriving and became the first openly gay minister to serve a historically non-LGBTQ church in the city. The congregation made a commitment to be a religious community for people who were not welcomed elsewhere. It started Hatch, which is now housed at the Montrose Center and has the distinction of being the city's oldest LGBTQIA+ youth group. It became a national leader for social justice, helping to spark the sanctuary movement of the 1980s. And it welcomed into its pulpit or organized programs in the city with such internationally known figures as Barbara Jordan, Joan Baez, who did a benefit concert to support the church's social justice work, and Thich Nhat Hanh. Shibley retired in 2002. His time here had marked a significant expansion of the kinds of answers to the existential question, who am I, that the congregation encouraged. Religious pluralism was embraced. The congregation had become a refuge for many who were not welcome elsewhere. Unfortunately, his charisma was such that now when the First Unitarian Church of Houston asked the question, what type of church do we want to become, they weren't totally certain how to answer it in his absence. The congregation resumed its old pattern of fighting with its ministers. Jose Ballester and Gail Lindsay Mariner lasted 4 years sharing the senior minister role together before being forced to resign in 2008. The conflict around their ministry caused about half the congregation to leave. Their tenure was followed by Daniel O'Connell's. He tried to grow the congregation by establishing a multi-site ministry. Unfortunately, he didn't first explore the question, what type of church do we want to become, with the members before doing so. So he had a negotiated resignation in 2018. Now, today, on our congregation's 110th anniversary, First Unitarian Universalist is again growing. The congregation's period of developmental ministry has allowed it to gain clarity on what kind of community it wants to become. Multiracial, multi-faith, multi-generational, and multicultural one located in the heart of the city. A place devoted to widening love's circle, where many answers to the question, who am I, are encouraged. A society devoted to the prospect of social salvation, Quillian Shin's old belief that our purpose is to make this world a paradise for all. This clarity has positioned First Unitarian Universalist as it emerges from developmental ministry and prepares to call its next settled minister to thrive in a way it has not done so in a long time. We've just finished a successful capital campaign. Sunday morning attendance is up 30% in the last 12 months. There's excitement about becoming the kind of congregation we want to be. So here's to another 110 years and to many adventures and many questions and answers along the way. Let's give thanks to all of our religious ancestors, named and unnamed, who have made this place what it is, a community of, as Emily Ladner said, of dreaming, truth-seeking, laughter, joy, and justice. That I might be so, I invite the congregation to give yourselves a round of applause. And say amen.